Hello, this is Julian with Coffea Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kiburi WX wash processed Ethiopia from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this coffee was featured in a recent blind taste test rankings video, where it finished second place out of 8 Coffea Circulor coffees on that day. And truth be told, the coffees that we did purchase from Coffea Circulor, this is the coffee I was least excited about, as it's the final coffee we added to our order to get us to the minimum for free shipping. That being said, it does offer a milk chocolate note, which is a little unique when it comes to wash processed Ethiopian coffees these days. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 45. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Given how many Coffea Circulor coffees we've reviewed over the years, we can say that there has been a little bit of variance in the coffees that we have received from them over the last couple of years. That being said, I looked to see which coffee roasters a lot of people compare Coffea Circulor to, and the two that kept popping up the most were Flower Child and Say, which in itself is kind of interesting given that we've had a fair bit of variance from both of those coffee roasters, especially Say, over the last couple of years. But for me, the roaster that it reminds me of the most is Swirl, which is another Scandinavian-based coffee roaster, one which we've also identified as being on the more moderately light side of things, and I can certainly see that with the coffees that we're reviewing from Coffea Circulor this time around as well. This coffee, of those coffees, does seem a little bit more developed than the other ones, and I feel like that's attributed to the more traditional base qualities of this one. So for that reason, we can say that this one still skews on the moderately light side of things, maybe on the slightly more developed side of that moderately light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, our blind taste test day, and the coffee was noted for being slightly brighter than initially expected, offering plenty of the listed peach characteristics to it in a slightly more sugary and clean sense. This one did perform pretty well, largely due to the clarity, as it's not really surprising that the two wash processed coffees performed best in that blind taste test video. This one mostly stood out given the citric characteristics of it, but even then I was kind of stumped to differentiate between this and the Panamanian coffee. Even then, I would say that it had a nice and pleasant first impression. Day 18 through the Chemex, and the coffee was still offering a slightly spiced feel, so something I didn't highlight in the first notes, but it is kind of interesting. When I opened all of these Coffea Circulor bags, I opened them in the presence of some other people, and all of them took in the aroma of the bags themselves, and they were really surprised to experience just how intense the aroma was of every single one of the bags that we did open up, this coffee included, and it had that slightly, what I describe as being a spiced bergamot characteristic that is pretty common in a lot of the Coffea Circulor coffees we've had over the years in general. So it wasn't too surprising that it was present within this coffee, but I think what was really surprising was just how much it did translate into the cup itself, as it does have that traditional base to it with plenty of the listed milk chocolate characteristic, but outside of that, there was that spiced characteristic kind of contrast against it. Other than that, a relatively light-bodied experience, as the coffee felt like it needed more time to open up, so it was decent. And as of this moment, it did make for a pretty interesting contrast, as the base of the coffee itself did feel traditional, having that milk chocolate component, but at the same time, it did feel like an Ethiopian coffee given the citric qualities of it, as well as the body being a little bit lighter. So just interesting second experience for this one as well. Day 21 through the UFO brewer, and the spice quality has dissipated relative to some of the earlier days, as it's offering more of the traditional qualities yet again in terms of the listed milk chocolate and vanilla characteristics. The primary florality within this coffee was in line with that vanilla quality, as it's an otherwise more generic citric component to it in a lemon-like sense, with a moderate experience, as this coffee isn't particularly intense as of these first couple of experiences. So we'll go ahead and move on to day 24, as we opted for the V60 with Coffea Circulor's recipe, which is a 15:1, and the brewing temperature ranges between 93 degrees Celsius and 95 degrees Celsius. We opted for the higher temperatures because I did feel like this coffee might have benefited from being pushed ever so slightly. And it did have one of the better days that we had experienced of this one, as it had more of the listed stone fruit characteristics and a sweeter citric quality as the coffee is beginning to open up. My theory on this day was that the coffee was better just because it had been opening up, as opposed to the adjustments that we had actually made in terms of the recipe. Otherwise, it was still dominated by the vanilla and chocolate characteristics of this one, as it's been surprising just how abundant those qualities have been within this coffee. Day 27, through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is finally starting to demonstrate its potential, as it's offering more of a traditional Ethiopian peach characteristic to it, which is one of the biggest selling points to me on this coffee. I was looking at a different wash processed Ethiopian coffee to purchase as well, but this one did set itself apart because it did have a peach note listed on there, which is usually a pretty good way to sell me on a coffee, but it did have some of those slight Ethiopian peach characteristics, but still skewed on the more traditional aspects, as it's sweeter and cleaner with a little bit more florality as the overall experience has improved. But even then, the base does continue to remain a little bit more reminiscent of the base of Central South American, more traditional Central South American coffees, still with a more African-like body to it. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it was offering the most amount of fruit intensity in the listed stone fruit sense, an interesting combination of traditionality and an Ethiopian quality, as it does continue to remain almost more of a fruit-forward chocolate bar experience, but better overall as we're finding improvement to this coffee with time. Day 36 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the coffee wasn't quite as impressive as some of the recent experiences, as it was skewing a little bit more on that traditional milk chocolate side of things with just traces of fruit. So it's good overall, but in comparison to some of the more recent experiences, not quite to the same extent. And final notes, we have day 42 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is nice again, as it does continue to remain surprisingly more chocolate forward than I might have expected given what this coffee is. And I feel like that really dominated a lot of our notes, largely because it's not quite what I was expecting from this coffee going into it. I did see the note, obviously, and I did take note of that, but even then I didn't expect it to translate as heavily as it did. Possibly the priming effect at play here, but for the most part, it was just that pretty prominent chocolate-like base, complemented by traces of fruit characteristics, including the peachiness, but also the citric qualities, which I do have to say were also pretty prominent and also pretty consistent. If anything, they were the more abundant quality to this coffee, but it was overshadowed by getting a characteristic that isn't overly common with what we experience in these sort of coffees. Florality primarily present in the vanilla-like sense, with the peachy quality a little bit more in the background this time instead. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have the cleanliness level 4. Let's go through quite a few level 4s, but let's start with the cleanliness, of course, level 4. And we're working with a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. Even if it does have that more traditional base to it, it definitely wasn't going to hinder the overall cleanliness of this one. If there's one thing that had potential to do so, it was that pretty notable and prominent spiced bergamot quality that was present early in the experience of this coffee, but that definitely did seem to dissipate. And towards the end, I completely forgot it ever existed within this coffee, so level 4, obviously the ideal place to put it. Finish, level 4. Finish is kind of interesting given the contrasting citric and chocolate characteristics of this coffee. Given that those were the two most abundant, they were also, interestingly, the most lingering, long-lasting quality within this coffee. I can see some of the other characteristics in a slightly more subtle sense, the peach, the vanilla, but for the most part, it did seem to be dominated by those two specific qualities. Sweetness, level 4. It did, I want to say, reach the level 4 for sweetness. It did have a fair bit of intensity, enough to the point where it was justified, but the type of sweetness that this coffee did offer definitely didn't come in the fruit sense. It definitely came in a little bit more of a candy bar sense, so that made for a unique experience overall, not something that you would typically get from a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. All right, next up we have the citrus fruit level 4. I mentioned that there's one quality that may be a little bit more abundant than the chocolate characteristics. It was the citric characteristics of this coffee, especially in the lemon-like sense. So For that reason, it did stand out being a little bit higher than the rest of the notes that we have listed on here at a level 4, and it was one of the first things that did stand out in this coffee in the blind taste test video. And I shouldn't go too overboard with describing this coffee as being traditional in that Central South American-like sense, because at the end of the day, when we were doing that blind taste test rankings video, this one did stand out as being pretty Ethiopian-like or even Panamanian-like. So it did offer enough of the characteristics to say, yeah, it's definitely going to be one of our cleaner, more lighter bodied cups of coffee. So take that as you will. Let's go ahead and move on to level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not the brightest coffee, a little bit more in the citric sense on this one, but again, didn't really expect this one to be the brightest coffee. Yeah, we'll just go ahead and move on from there. Florality level 3. Mentioned there are some traces of a vanilla-like florality to it, but even then, it's nowhere near as abundant as either the chocolate or citric characteristics or qualities of this one. So level 3 is where we opted to put that. Kind of low for being a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, but that's just what we were getting. Stone fruit level 3, and we did get a little bit of some peachy qualities to it throughout. It wasn't consistent, dominant, or pronounced enough to the point where we could justify it at the same mark as the citric qualities, but level 3 is where we opted to settle for it. Alongside the other level 3 we have, which is the chocolate at the level 3, and that has been the biggest discussion point of this coffee up to this point, is the chocolate, as it was very pronounced, very consistent, and if there's a reason it didn't reach that level 4 mark, it's because even with as pronounced and intense as it was within this coffee, it still pales in comparison to what you're going to get from like a old school traditional Guatemalan Mexican coffee. So for that reason, I decided just to leave it there to level 3 mark. Pretty prominent for being an Ethiopian coffee, but not quite so if you're comparing this to your Central American coffees. And then body level 3, that's probably going to be our final thing we're discussing. Even with this one being lighter bodied, towards the end, as I was brewing this coffee, I said, in comparison to your wash processed Ethiopian coffees, it does have a little bit more body, and I do want that notated within this tasting wheel as well. I was working on these tasting wheels alongside some of the other Coffea Circulor coffees, and it did stand out as being pretty close to those as well, which were also more medium bodied coffees. So level 3 is where I opted to put that at the end. Outside of that though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. So my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I said going into this review that this is the coffee I was least excited about, and by the end it was the coffee I was least excited to discuss as well. As I've also said in the past, that wash processed Ethiopian coffees are some of my least favorite coffees to review in general, as there wasn't anything that stood out about this coffee too much in comparison to so many of the other ones that we have reviewed in the past. I found it to be a solid coffee. It did have some interesting highs, and it did also have some days where it was just a little bit less exciting than I was expecting. So for the most part, I don't think I necessarily have too much to add to the end of this review. Just a pretty straightforward experience for a wash processed Ethiopian with a little bit of a different feel to it, which does take it into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. So in certain aspects, it does offer a little bit more of some traditional qualities and characteristics that I think would appeal to the more traditional coffee drinker. As mentioned, the chocolate characteristic did stand out, and as a result, it's also not necessarily the brightest at the end of the day. So having it be a little bit more sweet while still offering those traces of fruit qualities and characteristics, it can make for an interesting experience overall. Also still offering a little bit more body for people that tend to prefer that specific characteristic to a coffee, while Ethiopian coffees can be a little bit of a put off to them because they at times can be a little bit too floral, or they can be a little bit too light bodied. This one kind of toes the line between offering still plenty of the Ethiopian characteristics and a more traditional feel to it. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kiburi WX Wash Processed Ethiopia from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.